Welcome back to the Garden Hutch. Today we discuss what to expect during the second week of growing your own garden plants for summer. Let's get going. So last week we filled all of our seed trays, we got them watered in and planted our seeds. I'll put a link to that right up here. This week it's important that we discuss three things. We need to discuss moisture levels, temperature, and how to avoid damping disease. So as I mentioned last week, I do like to keep some dry field seed trays around. And the reason for this is it makes it really easy to decide how much water are in our actual plants. So if we use these peas that we've started here as an example, and we compare the weight of this to our compost, or to our dry seed tray, we can tell that this seed tray is good to go for now. We don't need to water it. One of the big problems that people have when starting their seeds is they either water too much or not enough. And I find this is the easiest way to know. Now you can try, a lot of people try the finger method where they'll put their finger in and kind of see if it's damp down to a certain point. And if that works for you, that's fine. My problem is I'm kind of a klutz, and I have a tendency of whenever I do that to either disturb the roots. I've even broken the plants if I don't have them directly in the center. So that's what sort of drove me to come up with a different way. Another thing to consider whenever we're watering is it's important that we don't water too often. Now, what I mean by that is I like to let my plants get relatively dry, not where it dries out all the way, of course, but where it's close to the dry feeling in the cells. And the reason for that is I find that the seeds and the plants themselves respond a lot better if we do a very thorough watering once every few days as opposed to a little watering every single day. So these, for example, you can see, hopefully I can get that in there. These tomatoes have already come up, and they came up in less than a week. One of the reasons that we have a lot of success in doing this is we keep the moisture levels consistent in here, and we don't water but about every 3 days right now. Of course, depending on the temperatures in your region, it could be more or less. For us this last week, the temperatures were in the mid 50s to low 60s. So in the greenhouse, it was probably, I don't know, a mean of maybe 75. So I found that every third day watering is absolutely perfect right now. So if the upcoming week, the temperatures are going to drop a little bit. So they'll be down into, like the upper 40s and mid 50s. During that, I may only have to water like one time the entire week. I just want to reiterate, that's why having these dry field containers are so important, because you never know what the fluctuation of temperatures inside of the area that you're growing. You never know how quickly the water is going to come out. So you'll kind of, over time, you'll kind of understand what's happening and the best way to do it. But for new people trying to start seeds, this is the way to go. Now, the second thing that I would like to touch on today is the temperature. So for our tomatoes and peppers, I do not bring them outside into the greenhouse until they've had the opportunity to sprout indoors. The area that we keep our seeds indoors, it stays between 75 and 80 degrees whenever the sun is up coming through that warm window. In the evening times, it may get down to around 70, but relatively speaking, for this time of year, it's a consistent heat, and it's much warmer than it would be outside or even, in a greenhouse over the nighttime. So what you have to think about when you're sprouting your seeds is the mean temperature. Like, actually, the lows may even play a bigger point. So even if your greenhouse gets 80 to 85 degrees, but it gets down to 35 degrees, your tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, most of your summer vegetables, are going to germinate really slowly. So by leaving them inside and then bringing them out, I allow that artificial heat inside to sort of increase the germination speed. And then whenever I bring them out, they start getting acclimated to the actual daylight cycle, which is good for them whenever they're germinating, because seeds, obviously, they have evolved to do well in the early springtime when you have shorter days, longer nights. That's whenever they go through the process of like growing. So you're actually mimicking the natural light. You're just doing it, a little bit earlier than they would in nature. Now let's talk about lows. In our area, it very rarely gets below freezing consistently. So it'll be like once a week, like this upcoming week, it'll get down to 30. You know, the 10-day forecast shows in the 10-day forecast, we'll have a 30 and we'll have a 31. Now in this greenhouse, our tomatoes and peppers would be just fine in that environment. I am a little paranoid though, so what I do is I go ahead, if it's going to be 30, I wait for the sun to go down, I take all these inside, stick them in my office. The next morning, I don't even wait for it to get above freezing, because as soon as the sun hits the greenhouse, it's starting to start warming up really fast. So at that point, I just bring everything back out to the greenhouse. Now, this is absolutely an unnecessary step that you do not have to do. Again, the only reason that I do it is because I'm kind of paranoid. I do want to add here real fast, if you don't have a greenhouse, temperature works exactly the same. You can let your plants germinate indoors in a warm windowsill where the house, your house or office or wherever you happen to be growing them, has a mean temperature that's above the 65-degree mark, which will speed your germination. You can leave them in that windowsill the majority of the time. What I would caution you though is I would start taking the plants outside in a direct sunlight as soon as it gets over 50 degrees. The reason for this is if you don't have direct sunlight on your plants, they have a tendency to get a little bit leggy. We'll go over that next week, but you want to avoid your, especially your tomatoes and your peppers, you want to avoid them stretching themselves out to get to the light. So what I did before we had the greenhouse is I would start my plants indoors just like I'm doing now, and instead of bringing them out to the greenhouse, every day there was a spot that got sunny at about 8:30 in the morning, and it would stay sunny until the sun went down. As soon as it got over 50 degrees, I would take my plants outside, I would put them in my designated area, and I would just leave them there. Sometimes we would get rain, which is nice. It also gives them a chance to sort of get exposed to wind so that the stalks get a little stronger before you have to put them outside. Another advantage to this is that you don't have to harden them off whenever the time comes to put them in your garden, because you've been doing that all year. One thing I would caution you though, if you're going to have a torrential downpour or you're going to have winds that are say over 30 miles an hour, I would not leave them outside that day. I would go ahead and just leave them in the windowsill. Doing that once or twice a week, it's not going to be the end of the world. They may get a little bit leggy, but as soon as they're outside consistently, it'll kind of strengthen your plants up so you can avoid that situation. Now, the third and final thing I wanted to discuss during week 2 for us to keep our eyes on is something called damping disease. Now, damping disease is sort of a broad term that covers a whole bunch of things. All it is soil-borne fungus or mold that will grow, and when it grows on the top of your seed cells, it'll kill your plants. So if you've ever grown plants and they got nice and pretty and then you just woke up one day and they broke off at the soil, fell over and died, chances are that was damping disease. How do we avoid this though? Well, we've already touched on 2 of them, right? Like the things that make it is if the top of the of your cells, the soil, I mean, if it stays damp and it stays cool, you're going to have a problem with damping disease, especially if you have in a greenhouse or an outside environment. So the 2 things that we discussed earlier in the video are great ways to avoid this, right? You want to make sure that you water all the way through thoroughly, and then before you water again, just let the soil dry out on the top. Not all the soil, obviously, but just on the top of your soil, let that dry out. We also, in the video that we mentioned that we did last week, we put cinnamon on the top. That also keeps those spores from germinating, so you don't have to worry about the mold or the fungus if you've sprinkled cinnamon on them. And the third, and maybe the easiest way to avoid it, is just UV light, right? If it's warm, they're not going to germinate. Also, if they're exposed to UV light like they are here in the greenhouse, or if you have a sunny spot during the day that you leave them, that UV light will prevent any of them from germinating and killing your plants off. Well, that about wraps it up for today's episode. Next Friday, we are going to discuss how to thin our plants out, how to avoid our plants getting too leggy, and finally, we'll discuss how to deal with the inevitable and variable weather that comes with the spring. As always, I appreciate all you folks that stuck it out here with us till the end. I hope everyone takes care of themselves. Until next time, peace.